The flight began as so many others do, with the soft hum of conversations blending with the rolling of suitcases along the terminal floor. Families clutched boarding passes and passports. Business travelers scrolled through phones, and children tugged at their parents' arms, impatient to get moving. There was a certain rhythm to it, a familiarity in the way people queued up at the gate, presented their tickets, and walked down the narrow jet bridge into the aircraft. The scent of recycled air, the sight of neat rows of seats, and the polite but tired smiles of flight attendants gave a sense of routine that reassured everyone. This was just another flight. Nothing more, nothing less. Passengers settled in with the same small rituals. Some adjusted air vents and buckled seat belts tightly, while others slipped off shoes and pulled out books or headphones. A man by the window unfolded a newspaper, a young couple whispered excitedly about their trip ahead, and a mother carefully tucked a blanket around her sleeping child. Even the woman who would soon alter the course of this flight seemed indistinguishable from the others. Dressed in ordinary clothes, she moved quietly, stowing her bag in the overhead bin before taking her seat, with little notice from anyone around her. To the other passengers, she was just another traveler, no different from the rest. As the engines roared to life, vibrations filled the cabin. People leaned back as the plane pushed forward down the runway, acceleration pressing them into their seats. A collective silence fell as the aircraft lifted, tilting gently before leveling into the open sky. Some passengers stared out of the windows, watching the city shrink below, while others already immersed themselves in the distractions they had brought along. There was comfort in the routine, in the expectation that the hours ahead would pass in a blur of snacks, small naps, and perhaps an in-flight movie. The sense of safety that comes with familiarity made everyone relax, unaware of how fragile that safety truly was. The crew moved through the aisle with practiced ease, offering drinks, answering questions, and reassuring nervous flyers. The cabin was filled with the quiet buzz of normality, the click of seatbelts, the rustle of snack wrappers, the low murmur of conversations blending into white noise. There was no sign of what was to come. The woman, calm and observant, seemed entirely absorbed in the ordinary flow of the journey. She offered a faint smile to the attendant who handed her a glass of water, adjusted the strap of her watch, and glanced briefly around the cabin before lowering her eyes again. It is often in these seemingly uneventful moments that life delivers its sharpest turns. The passengers could not have imagined that danger was already present among them, concealed behind faces that gave little away. The calm of the cabin carried on, but underneath, something darker was quietly waiting. For now, though, everyone remained wrapped in the illusion of routine. The hum of the engines became a lullaby, the steady altitude a comfort, and the shared belief was that this was nothing more than another ordinary flight, moving steadily through the sky, carrying strangers toward their destinations. The woman remained silent, her demeanor blending perfectly into the anonymity of the crowd. She looked no different from the tired businessman across the aisle, the teenager scrolling through music, or the elderly couple dozing against each other. If anyone had noticed her at all, it would have been as a fleeting glance, the kind people forget almost instantly. No one could have guessed that within her rested skills, discipline, and training that could alter the fate of every soul on board. For now, she remained invisible, just as she intended, allowing the ordinary to cloak her until the extraordinary became necessary. The minutes ticked by in gentle rhythm, the aircraft sailing through clouds while passengers adjusted to the long stretch of travel ahead. Every detail of the scene suggested normalcy. The tapping of a keyboard, the soft laughter of a child, the muted voices of two friends sharing a story. Each sound was a reminder of how routine this journey seemed, how unremarkable the day had begun. What none of them realized was that the fragile peace inside the cabin was only a surface layer, one that could shatter in an instant. The plane, steady and calm, carried not just passengers and their luggage but secrets and dangers unseen, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the moment when everything ordinary would come undone. It happened so suddenly that the shift in atmosphere felt almost unreal, as though the cabin had slipped from one reality into another without warning. The flight that had begun with calm routines and familiar comforts was pierced by sharp voices that did not belong to the flight crew. The clatter of metal, the sound of movement in the aisles, and then the unmistakable sight of men rising from their seats, their faces obscured by masks, weapons flashing under the overhead lights. What had been a safe haven high above the earth transformed into a place of fear in a matter of seconds. Passengers froze in disbelief, their minds struggling to register what their eyes were seeing. The quiet hum of the plane was replaced with chaos, with orders barked harshly in tones that left no room for disobedience. The terrorists moved with purpose, their steps quick and deliberate as they spread down the aisle, asserting control over the space that only moments earlier had been filled with harmless routines. Hands shot into the air instinctively, cries escaped from lips that trembled, and children began to wail in confusion. The flight attendants, caught in the sudden storm, could do little but obey as weapons turned toward them, forcing compliance. The illusion of safety had been shattered. What had been a sealed cocoon of routine in the sky was now a prison, hijacked by strangers who held everyone's lives in their hands. The leader of the group made his presence known with his voice first. It was sharp, commanding, heavy with an authority that brooked no hesitation. He barked out demands, his words filled with menace as he laid out the reality of their control. No one would resist, no one would speak, no one would move without permission. The passengers sat stunned, paralyzed by the weight of fear that now filled every corner of the cabin. The simple act of breathing felt dangerous, as though even the smallest sound could draw unwanted attention. Eyes darted around in desperation, searching for answers, for solutions, for escape, but finding none. Every element of the takeover was designed to terrify. The sight of weapons, the force in the terrorists' voices, the speed with which they seized control, it all worked together to silence resistance before it could even begin. Fear spread like fire, moving seat by seat, gripping hearts with cold hands. Mothers clutched their children close, men lowered their eyes to avoid confrontation, and flight attendants tried to remain composed even as panic churned inside them. The weight of the hijackers' presence pressed down on everyone, suffocating and absolute. The terrorists herded people with gestures and shouts, making sure all eyes remained lowered. Their movements carried the confidence of men who believed they were untouchable, who had entered the plane with a plan and knew exactly how they intended to carry it out. They carried themselves with the certainty of those who believed fear would be their most powerful weapon, and for the moment, it was working. The passengers obeyed, trembling and silent, held hostage not just by the weapons pointed at them, but by the overwhelming terror that filled the space. Yet within that fear, time seemed to slow. Seconds stretched into minutes, each one heavy with dread as the reality of the situation sank deeper into the minds of the passengers. This was no ordinary disruption, no temporary scare. This was a hijacking, and with each order barked, with each movement of the masked men, it became clear that the plane's original destination was no longer in their hands. The hijackers now controlled not only the cabin but the very fate of everyone aboard. Even the smallest movements seemed magnified under their watchful eyes. A cough drew attention. A shift in posture caused a gun to swing toward the offender. The passengers quickly learned that silence and stillness were their only protection, that compliance was the only shield they had in the face of such overwhelming force. The atmosphere grew heavier with every passing second, suffocating under the knowledge that at any moment, violence could erupt. From the cockpit door to the rear of the plane, the terrorists moved like shadows, ensuring that fear held tight to its grip. They controlled the aisles, they controlled the crew, and they controlled the air itself. The passengers sat immobilized, hearts pounding, their minds spiraling with questions they dared not voice. Who were these men? What did they want? How would this end? The answers remained locked away behind masks and weapons, leaving only uncertainty and dread to gnaw at the edges of their thoughts. The takeover was not just a physical act, it was psychological warfare. By seizing the plane so quickly, by showing their dominance so openly, the terrorists had planted a seed of hopelessness. And as the minutes dragged on, that seed took root in the silence, growing stronger with every passing heartbeat. The cabin that had once felt routine and safe now belonged to fear, reshaped by the will of men who had claimed it as their own. The moment the terrorists announced themselves, the atmosphere inside the cabin shifted completely. What had once been a hum of idle chatter and the rustle of snack wrappers turned into a silence so sharp it seemed unnatural. Fear did not need to be spoken. It radiated from every row, gripping passengers with an invisible force. It was in the way people sat rigid, barely daring to breathe. It was in the wide, unblinking eyes of a child clinging to her mother's arm. It was in the trembling hands of an elderly man who pressed his palms together as if in prayer. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating, as though the oxygen itself had been tainted by dread. The crew, usually a source of reassurance, were no longer able to offer comfort. Their smiles were gone, replaced with pale faces and cautious movements as they followed the terrorists' orders. Even the smallest gesture was carefully measured, their fear visible in every motion. The passengers looked to them for guidance, but what they saw only mirrored the terror already swelling in their own hearts. For the first time, everyone on board understood with chilling clarity that the crew, too, were powerless. The terrorists had not only taken control of the physical space, but had also seized the minds of every person on the plane. Fear became the true weapon, sharper than the rifles they carried, stronger than the commands they shouted. It stripped people of their voices, stole their courage, and replaced it with submission. Parents who would normally comfort their children sat frozen, too terrified to move. Friends who might have whispered reassurance to each other remained silent, afraid that even the sound of their breath might draw unwanted attention. Time moved differently under the weight of such fear. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Every creak of the plane, every shift in turbulence, sent shudders through the passengers as they wondered if it might trigger violence. Some tried to look away, to distract themselves by staring at the back of the seat in front of them, but the presence of armed men pacing the aisles was impossible to ignore. Every step, every glance, was a reminder of how completely the balance of power had shifted. The terrorists thrived on this silence. They moved deliberately, knowing the fear in the passengers' eyes was proof of their control. They barked orders not because they needed to, but because the sound of their voices reinforced the terror already rooted in the cabin. Each command echoed through the plane, a reminder that lives now hung by a thread that could be cut without warning. The passengers sat locked in stillness, a collection of individuals bound together by a single shared terror. Among them, whispers of despair took silent form. Though no words were spoken, the thoughts in every mind were the same. Would they ever land safely? Would they see their loved ones again? What fate awaited them in the hands of these men who showed no hesitation, no mercy? The fear was not just for themselves, but for everyone they loved, for everything that might be lost in a single act of violence. That kind of fear digs deep, becoming more than an emotion. It becomes a presence, something alive and suffocating that fills every inch of the space around you. The children on board were perhaps the most haunting reflection of that fear. Some cried softly, their small voices breaking the silence with painful reminders of innocence caught in the grip of cruelty. Others sat unnaturally still, their wide eyes watching the masked men with a kind of paralyzing confusion. They did not fully understand what was happening, but they felt it, absorbed it from the trembling bodies of the adults around them. Fear does not need explanation. It passes from one person to the next like an unseen contagion. There were those who tried to hide their fear, attempting to steady their breathing, clench their fists, and remain composed. Yet even they could not escape the trembling in their legs or the pounding of their hearts. No amount of forced composure could mask the truth. The entire cabin was drowning in terror. The silence was not one of calm, but of paralysis, of people too afraid to resist, too afraid even to hope. It was in that silence that despair took root. Passengers avoided each other's eyes, not wanting to see their own terror reflected back at them. Each second that passed deepened the belief that there was no escape, no chance of rescue. The world outside seemed impossibly far away, and inside that sealed metal tube, fear reigned supreme. It was not just the presence of weapons that created it. It was the uncertainty, the knowledge that their lives were in the hands of those who cared nothing for them. The fear was absolute, pressing down like an invisible weight, silencing every voice, crushing every instinct except survival. It held them all in its grip, binding strangers together in a shared, unspoken dread. The terrorists had taken the plane, but it was fear that had taken the passengers. Amid the heavy silence, When fear seemed to suffocate every corner of the cabin, there was one presence that did not bend to it. While others froze in their seats, eyes lowered, hearts pounding with dread, she remained steady. To anyone watching closely, her demeanor was not the trembling submission of those around her, but something calmer, sharper, more controlled. She sat upright, her eyes scanning not in panic but with calculation, quietly observing every movement of the men who had seized control. The chaos had erupted suddenly, but her reaction was deliberate, her breathing even, her posture composed. It was as though she were tuned to a frequency different from the rest of the passengers, one that allowed her to see through the terror into the patterns beneath. The terrorists, so used to dominance, did not notice her in the way they noticed others. Their eyes sought fear, thrived on the trembling of hands, the sobs of children, the cries that broke out when weapons were raised. She did not offer them that satisfaction. To them, she looked like any other woman, quiet, still, unremarkable. Yet behind the calm facade, her mind was working with relentless precision, assessing exits, measuring distances, cataloging the number of men, the type of weapons they carried, the order in which they barked commands. Every detail was filed away, not in panic, but in preparation. The passengers around her clutched at armrests, hid their faces, or tried to shrink into invisibility. But she had trained for moments like these, moments where hesitation meant death, where clarity mattered more than fear. The discipline drilled into her over years of service had taught her that panic was the enemy. And so, while her heart surely beat faster like everyone else's, her control over her body made it invisible. She was still, her eyes watchful but unflinching, her breath measured, her presence like a stone in the middle of a raging current. Fear is contagious, but so is calm. Those seated near her, though they did not fully understand why, found a strange comfort in her stillness. They could feel it in the subtle energy she radiated, the way her shoulders did not slump in defeat, but remained squared, as if braced for something greater. She was not reckless. She did not make sudden moves that would draw attention. But there was something in her silence that carried a different weight than the silence of fear. Hers was a silence of restraint, of patience, of waiting for the right moment. The hijackers moved through the aisles, shouting orders and waving their weapons, feeding off the terror they had created. They controlled the passengers with intimidation, but their control was imperfect. Hidden among the fear, there was one who was not broken, who refused to surrender inwardly. It was not defiance in the loud, reckless sense, but defiance nonetheless. It was the kind that grows in quiet strength, the kind that does not show its hand until the time comes. Her calm was not without cost. She understood the stakes better than anyone. She knew the danger was real, that a single wrong move could mean death not just for herself, but for dozens of others trapped in that metal shell high above the earth. That knowledge did not weaken her, it sharpened her focus. Every cry from a child, every trembling plea from a passenger, every threat spat from the terrorist's lips became fuel for her resolve. She knew she could not act yet, but she also knew she would. To the untrained eye, she was a passenger lost in the same despair as the rest. But behind her steady gaze lay experience, behind her calm face lay training, and behind her silence lay intent. She was measuring the men who thought they controlled the plane, watching the way they moved, the way they signaled to each other, the hierarchy among them. She saw what others could not, the small fractures in their unity, the tells in their body language, the weaknesses that could be exploited when the moment came. The cabin was filled with fear, but she carved out her own space within it, an island of clarity amid a storm of panic. Where others felt powerless, she carried within her the knowledge of power, not yet revealed, but always present. She was the unseen counterbalance, the hidden force biding her time while the hijackers believed themselves invincible. The difference between her and the others was not circumstance, it was choice. She chose discipline over panic, awareness over paralysis, calm over chaos. The terrorists had no idea that among the passengers they had silenced, there was one who could not be broken. They saw a woman, anonymous and ordinary, and dismissed her as no threat. What they could not see was the iron discipline beneath the quiet, the storm concealed beneath the stillness. She sat among the frightened, indistinguishable on the surface, but unlike them, she was not waiting for fate to decide the outcome. She was waiting for her moment. The breaking point came when the terrorists believed they had complete control. They shouted louder, their movements grew sharper, and their eyes scanned the cabin with a mix of arrogance and anticipation. The fear they had cultivated seemed to fuel them, but what they did not realize was that fear, once stretched too thin, could also snap. The woman had watched long enough, measured long enough, and prepared long enough. She could sense the moment shifting, the fragile balance of intimidation beginning to crack under the weight of their own aggression. It was in that instant, when the cabin seemed to suffocate under chaos, that she made her choice. With a fluidity that came only from years of rigorous training, she rose from her seat. The passengers around her gasped in disbelief, their eyes widening as if they were watching someone step into certain death. But her movements carried no hesitation. Her body seemed to know what to do before her mind had even finished forming the thought. The terrorists noticed her too late. By the time they turned their attention toward her, she was already in motion, her body striking with a precision that left no room for error. A weapon was knocked aside, a man staggered back, and for the first time since the hijacking began, power shifted inside the cabin. The passengers could hardly process what they were seeing. The woman who had sat silently among them, the one they had dismissed as just another traveler, now moved with the speed and focus of someone trained for exactly this. She wasn't flailing, she wasn't acting on desperation. Every strike, every step, every movement was calculated, efficient, and controlled. She fought not as someone trying to survive, but as someone carrying the weight of responsibility for everyone else on board. In that moment, she revealed not just courage but the truth of who she was. She was not merely a passenger. She was a Navy SEAL pilot, a warrior hidden in plain sight. The revelation hit the passengers like a spark in the darkness. They had been drowning in helplessness, but now, before their eyes, stood proof that they were not abandoned. A trained protector was among them, someone who could fight back against the terror that had suffocated them since the moment the hijackers stormed the cabin. Murmurs turned into cries of astonishment, and then into something stronger, a sense of hope that had been completely absent just moments before. The sight of her fighting, steady and unshaken, reignited something in every heart aboard that plane. The terrorists, once so confident, were rattled. They had not accounted for resistance, let alone resistance of this caliber. They shouted orders at each other, their once coordinated movements now fractured by surprise and disarray. Their control was slipping, and they knew it. For the first time, their power was challenged not by pleading voices or terrified silence, but by someone who matched their violence with skill and purpose. They had expected fear to carry the day, but what they now faced was something far more dangerous. A professional fighter, someone who had dedicated her life to mastering situations exactly like this. Each second felt stretched, each movement magnified under the weight of its importance. Her training gave her the advantage, but what drove her was not just discipline. It was the knowledge that the lives of every man, woman, and child in that cabin depended on her. The stakes were beyond calculation, and yet she bore them with the steadiness of someone who had prepared her entire life to protect others. Every strike was not just an act of defense, but an act of defiance against those who believed fear alone could bend humanity. The atmosphere inside the plane shifted dramatically. The air that had been thick with despair was now charged with something entirely different: courage. Passengers who had clung to hopelessness now watched with eyes wide, breaths held, their hearts pounding not from dread, but from the sight of resilience. They began to believe that survival was possible, that victory could be wrestled from the jaws of terror. It was not just her physical fight that transformed the cabin, but the unspoken message carried in her actions. They were not powerless, and they were not alone. Her revelation as a Navy SEAL pilot was more than a personal truth. It was a turning point for everyone aboard. The weight of her presence, the clarity of her movements, the certainty of her skill, it all combined to shatter the illusion of invincibility the terrorists had cloaked themselves in. She had pulled back the curtain and exposed them as vulnerable, fallible, beatable. And in doing so, she gave the passengers something that no weapon, no intimidation, no shouting threat could take away from them: hope. The fight was far from over, but the spell of terror had been broken. The woman who had seemed invisible, ordinary, and unremarkable was now the symbol of resistance, the embodiment of strength that no hijacker could have foreseen. What had begun as a silent calculation now unfolded as open defiance, a battle waged in the narrow aisles of a plane thousands of feet in the air, where every second mattered and every move shaped the outcome of all on board. The cabin was no longer the same place it had been at the start of the flight. What had once been filled with routine sounds and casual comfort had transformed into a crucible of survival, charged with a tension so sharp it seemed to cut through the air. The woman's revelation, her defiance, had already torn apart the illusion of total control the terrorists had built. But the true test was still unfolding. Every second counted, and the thin walls of the aircraft bore witness to a struggle that determined not just the fate of those inside, but potentially many more beyond. Her movements carried purpose. Years of training had honed her instincts to the point where they seemed to operate ahead of thought itself. She struck with precision, disarmed with efficiency, and countered with a speed that made the terrorists hesitate for the first time. Each hesitation on their part was an opportunity, and she seized them without pause. Passengers who once cowered in silence now watched with breathless anticipation, their fear no longer overwhelming, but transforming into something else: admiration, trust, and a fragile sense of possibility. The terrorists fought with desperation. They shouted to one another, their plans unraveling as panic began to seep into their confidence. Their weapons, once symbols of absolute dominance, seemed less menacing against the sheer force of her will and the clarity of her strikes. They were armed, yes, but she was armed with something greater: mastery. Her body, her mind, her willpower, all sharpened into weapons through years of grueling training and missions few could imagine. And it was this, not brute force, that shifted the balance in her favor. Amid the clash, the passengers began to sense the changing tide. A man in the back clenched his fists tighter, no longer shrinking into his seat, but leaning forward as though ready to act. A mother, who had held her child close in trembling arms, now whispered words of reassurance, her voice steadier than before. The energy inside the cabin was contagious. Where fear had once spread like fire, now hope began to burn just as fiercely. All of it stemmed from her decision not to remain hidden, her choice to rise and reveal the truth of who she was. She moved like someone who understood not just combat, but responsibility. Every strike was controlled, every decision calculated to minimize risk to the innocents around her. The confined space of the plane made every move dangerous, but she adapted as if the environment itself was just another obstacle in training. To the passengers, it looked like something beyond human, but to her, it was the natural result of endless hours of discipline, of pushing herself through limits most people would never approach. The terrorists tried to rally. Their voices grew harsher, their commands more frantic, but beneath the surface was the undeniable scent of fear. They had entered this plane believing themselves unstoppable, prepared to turn it into a weapon, but they had not anticipated this. An adversary who met them not with pleas but with resistance, not with submission but with skill. Their confidence faltered because deep down, they understood that they were not facing an ordinary passenger. They were facing someone who embodied the very ideals they sought to destroy: courage, sacrifice, and unyielding strength. For the passengers, the scene unfolding was more than a fight for survival. It was a story being written before their eyes, one that would forever change the way they saw themselves and the world. The woman's courage gave them more than safety. It gave them perspective. In her, they saw what was possible when fear is not the master, when discipline triumphs over panic, when one person decides that surrender is not an option. It was not just her fight anymore. It was a shared battle, one that every person in that cabin felt in their own hearts. The plane seemed suspended not just in the sky, but in a moment that defied time. Each second was heavy, each movement decisive. Her voice, calm and commanding when it finally cut through the chaos, carried weight far greater than the terrorists' shouts. It was the voice of authority, of reassurance, of someone who knew exactly what had to be done and was willing to bear the burden of doing it. For the passengers, that voice was the anchor they clung to in the storm, the sound that reminded them they were not abandoned. What had begun as an ordinary flight had transformed into a battleground, and within it, the woman stood as the dividing line between despair and hope, defeat and survival. She carried herself not just as a fighter, but as a protector, her every action a shield for those who could not defend themselves. In her strength, they found their own, and in her defiance, they found the spark to believe that they, too, could endure what had once seemed impossible. The battle raged on in the narrow aisles, but the outcome was no longer dictated solely by the weapons of the hijackers. It now rested on something far greater, the unyielding spirit of a Navy SEAL who refused to let terror decide the ending.